Good evening, and welcome back to our quiet space. Tonight we will continue our journey. We will step out of the silence of November 1918 and into the 20 fragile years that followed. 20 years full of hope and full of fear. We will watch how a forced peace planted the seeds of a far more terrible conflict. Take a deep breath. Feel the cool air enter. And as you exhale, release all tension. Let your mind become calm and open. Our story tonight is about the Second World War, a war that did not just change the map, but also changed the very essence of humanity itself. This is a story of shadow and of light. There is no need to focus too hard. Just let my voice be your guide, and let this story flow like a deep river at night. The First World War, the war to end all wars, was over. But in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles in 1919, the victors did not create peace. They created retribution. The Treaty of Versailles was a document written in anger. Germany, defeated, was forced to accept full blame for the war. Germany lost its territory, its military was disarmed, and it was burdened with enormous reparations payments, a debt they could never possibly pay. Imagine a proud nation, now on its knees in shame and in anger. The Weimar Republic, Germany's new government, was born in chaos, trying to build a democracy on a foundation of ruin. In Italy, they felt betrayed. They had been on the winning side, but they did not get what they were promised. Frustration began to smolder. The seeds had been planted, the seeds of hatred, the seeds of humiliation, the seeds for the next war. They only needed time to grow. Then, in 1929, the world shook again, not by bombs, but by money. The Great Depression. The stock market in New York collapsed, and it pulled the entire world into an abyss. Factories closed and banks failed. Millions of people lost everything. In the streets of Berlin, educated men lined up just for a bowl of soup. Hunger and desperation are the most fertile soil for extreme ideas.
People no longer trusted the democracies that seemed to have failed to give them bread. They yearned for simple answers and a strong leader, someone who promised to restore their jobs, their dignity, and their pride. In Italy, a man named Benito Mussolini had seen this chance early. With his black shirts and his jutting chin, he promised to restore the glory of the Roman Empire and created fascism, an ideology of the power of the state above all else. He marched on Rome and took control. And in Germany, a failed artist and a veteran of the First World War found his calling. Adolf Hitler was a hypnotic orator. He spoke not to people's logic, but to their pain and their anger. He gave them enemies to blame and a promise of a Third Reich, an empire that would last 1,000 years. His Nazi party, once small, grew as the unemployment numbers grew. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany, legally. The world did not pay much attention, as the world was busy with its own problems. Meanwhile, far across the globe in Asia, the Empire of Japan had its own dreams. They were an industrial nation, hungry for resources they did not have: rubber, oil, and steel. The military took control of the government, believing it was Japan's destiny to liberate Asia from European colonists and rule it for themselves. In 1931, they invaded Manchuria in China. The League of Nations, the organization formed to prevent war, only protested. No one acted. The message received was clear. aggression was tolerated. Hitler began to test the world. He saw the reluctance of Britain and France, who were still haunted by the horror of the First World War and would do anything to avoid another one. In 1936, Hitler took his first gamble. He sent his troops into the Rhineland, a region of Germany that was supposed to be a demilitarized zone according to the Versailles Treaty. His generals were nervous. If France fought back, they would have to retreat. France did nothing. Britain did nothing. Hitler learned a valuable lesson. The world was more afraid of war than he was. He grew bolder and formed the Rome-Berlin Axis alliance with Mussolini. Then he turned his eyes to his homeland, Austria. In 1938, he annexed Austria without a single shot being fired. The world again only protested. Next, he wanted Czechoslovakia, a new democratic country protected by France. Hitler claimed he only wanted to protect the German-speaking people there.
This was a crisis point. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew to Munich to meet with Hitler, desperately wanting peace. In the Munich Agreement, Britain and France agreed to give Czechoslovakia to Hitler in exchange for his promise that this was his last territorial demand. Chamberlain flew home to London, waving a piece of paper, saying he had brought peace for our time. The crowds cheered, except for one man, Winston Churchill, who said in Parliament, "You were given the choice between war and dishonor. You chose dishonor, and you will have war." 6 months later, Hitler broke his promise and took the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now the world knew that war was inevitable. Summer 1939, Europe held its breath. The only thing Hitler feared was a war on two fronts, against France and the Soviet Union at the same time. Then the world was stunned. The anti-communist Hitler and the Soviet dictator Stalin signed a non-aggression pact. Secretly, they agreed to divide Poland between them. The path was now open. On September 1, 1939, Fajar Barusajamiensing, when German troops moved across the border into Poland. This was not the trench warfare of 1914. It was something new and fast. They called it Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. Tanks, panzers, moved quickly, supported by dive bombers, Stukas, that shrieked, dropping terror from the sky. Poland fought bravely, but they were overwhelmed. Britain and France declared war on Germany, but they were too slow to save Poland. In a few weeks, Poland was gone from the map. Then came the winter, and a strange quiet called the Phony War, as if the world was thinking what to do next. In the spring of 1940, the Blitzkrieg struck again. Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, and then they turned on France. They avoided France's main line of defense in a shocking way, moving through the Ardennes forest, which was thought to be impenetrable by tanks. The Allied armies were stunned, cut off and cornered on the beaches in a town named Dunkirk.
Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were trapped, waiting to be annihilated. But in what was called the Miracle of Dunkirk, a fleet of small boats, yachts, fishing boats, ferries from all over England sailed across the channel under fire and rescued over 300,000 men. They had saved the army, but they had lost the battle. A few weeks later, Paris fell. France surrendered. Hitler did a little dance in front of the Eiffel Tower. He had avenged Germany's defeat in the First World War in less than 6 weeks. Summer 1940. Hitler was the master of Europe. From Poland to the Atlantic Ocean, only one nation still stood against him: Britain. "The Battle of France is over," said their new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, on the radio. "I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin." Hitler planned to invade Britain, but first He had to control the skies. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, began bombing British airfields and factories. Every day, the young pilots of the Royal Air Force, RAF, flew their Spitfires and Hurricanes to fight the more numerous German planes. They were young men from Britain, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Canada. They fought high above the green fields of Kent. Churchill said of them, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Germany was frustrated, having failed to destroy the RAF. Hitler changed tactics and began bombing the cities, the Blitz. For 57 nights in a row, London was bombed. Fires raged across the city. People slept in the subway stations, but they were not broken. They endured. And as autumn arrived, Hitler realized he had failed to control the skies. The invasion of Britain was called off. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. After failing in the West, Hitler made the most decisive and most fatal decision of the war. He turned east. On June 22, 1941, he broke his pact with Stalin and launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This was the largest front in human history. 3 million German soldiers moved across a border that stretched for thousands of miles. The Blitzkrieg worked again. The Soviet armies were shattered. Hundreds of thousands were captured. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles, coming close to Moscow. But they had not counted on two things: the sheer size of Russia and General Winter. The winter of 1941 came early and was the coldest in 100 years. The German soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, watched the oil in their tanks freeze and their engines die. And outside the gates of Moscow, for the first time, the German army was stopped and pushed back. The war in the East would become a brutal, long war of attrition. While Hitler was bogged down in the Russian snow, the war was raging elsewhere. In the deserts of North Africa, British forces fought the Germans and Italians for control of the Suez Canal. In the Atlantic Ocean, German U-boats tried to choke Britain by sinking supply ships from America. The war had spread to almost the entire world. There was still one giant left sleeping. Japan had watched the success of its Axis allies in Europe. They saw that France and the Netherlands had been defeated, leaving their colonies in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, vulnerable. Japan decided this was the time to take its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. There was only one obstacle in their way: the American Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japan devised a daring and deeply secret plan. If they could destroy the American fleet in one surprise attack, they would have time to conquer the entire Pacific before America could recover. On the morning of December 7, 1941, a quiet Sunday, Japanese planes appeared from the clouds and dropped bombs and torpedoes on the American battleships resting peacefully at anchor. In 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet was devastated. Thousands were killed. It was a brilliant tactical victory for Japan and the single greatest strategic mistake in history. President Franklin Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy. Japan had not destroyed America. They had awakened a sleeping giant. The next day, America declared war on Japan. A few days later, Hitler, in solidarity, declared war on America. Now this conflict truly became a world war. The year 1942 began as the darkest year. The Axis was at its peak. Germany pushed deeper into Russia, towards the oil fields and a city named Stalingrad. Japan swept across the Pacific, conquering the Philippines, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia. It seemed they were unstoppable.
But then, slowly,
The tide began to turn in 3 places across the world. First, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in June 1942, at the Battle of Midway. America, having broken the Japanese secret codes, laid a trap. In 5 decisive minutes, American dive bombers found 4 Japanese aircraft carriers while their decks were full of bombs and fuel. The Japanese Navy never recovered. Second, in the African desert in October 1942, at El Alamein, British forces under General Montgomery stopped the advance of General Rommel, the Desert Fox of Germany. It was the first major land victory for the Allies. And third, in the most brutal Russian winter, in the rubble of the city of Stalingrad. For months, German and Soviet soldiers fought from house to house in the most savage battle in history. The German Sixth Army was trapped. Hitler forbade them from retreating. In February 1943, starving and frozen, they finally surrendered. This was the beginning of the end for Hitler in the East. The tide had turned. From this point on, the Allies would only advance. The Allies began to push back from every direction. In Italy, American and British troops landed, and Mussolini was overthrown. In the East, the Soviet Red Army began to push the German war machine backwards across Russia and Poland in a bloody, mile-by-mile grind. And in England, the largest invasion force in history was being assembled to open the decisive Second Front, Operation Overlord. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, in the darkness before dawn, paratroopers landed behind the German lines in Normandy, France. Then, at dawn, an armada of thousands of ships appeared and landed hundreds of thousands of soldiers on 5 heavily defended beaches. It was the greatest gamble of the war, and it worked. The Allies were on the continent. France would be liberated. That winter, Hitler tried one last desperate gamble in the Battle of the Bulge, but it failed. The year 1945 was the collapse. Germany was now being squeezed from 2 sides, the Soviets in the east, the Americans and British in the west. They were racing to Berlin.
Beneath the city, in his bunker, Hitler, listening to the sound of Soviet artillery getting closer, finally accepted that his 1,000-year Reich had collapsed. On April 30th, 1945, he ended his own life. A few days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In Europe, people were celebrating, but in the Pacific, the war still raged with brutal ferocity. American forces were island-hopping, getting closer and closer to Japan. The battles on Iwo Jima and Okinawa showed that the Japanese soldiers would fight to the very last man. They would not surrender. American leaders faced a terrible choice. Invading Japan would cost perhaps 1 million American lives and millions of Japanese lives. But there was a secret project, the Manhattan Project. Scientists had succeeded in splitting the atom and had created a new weapon of unimaginable power, the atomic bomb. The new American president, Harry Truman, made the decision to use it. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber flew over the city of Hiroshima and dropped a single bomb. In an instant, the city vanished in a blinding ball of fire and a terrible mushroom cloud. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. Japan was stunned. The Emperor Hirohito finally intervened and ordered the military to surrender. On August 15, 1945, the Second World War was well and truly over. The world that emerged from the smoke and rubble was a world deeply wounded. The human cost was almost incomprehensible. Between 60 and 80 million people were dead, the vast majority of them civilians. The war had also revealed the deepest darkness of human nature. The world finally learned the full scale of the Holocaust, the Nazis' systematic plan to annihilate an entire people, the industrial murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. The world vowed never again. The Nuremberg trials established a new principle that just following orders was not an excuse for crimes against humanity. The map of the world was redrawn again. Germany and Korea were divided. The European colonial empires in Asia and Africa began to crumble. The age of imperialism was ending. And from the ashes, two new superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. Uneasy allies during the war, they were now bitter rivals in what would become the Cold War. The world now lived under the shadow of the new terrible weapon that could destroy the planet. And yet, from the greatest tragedy in history came one of the greatest hopes. In 1945, leaders from around the world gathered to create the United Nations, the UN, an attempt to ensure that this kind of destruction would never happen again. A promise to talk instead to fight. Our story for tonight has ended. The story of the darkest shadow in our history. The story of how the world was broken and tried to build itself again. Now let your mind release the echoes of this heavy past. The history books are closed for tonight. You are safe, you are comfortable, and it is time to rest. Let the silence and the quiet dark carry you into a deep and peaceful sleep. Good night. Sleep well.